So this is the third and last part of the screencast for Lesson 4 on We the People about the origins of the American constitutionalism from Great Britain. And so we were looking at the Petition of Right. And so these are the notes that I have. Again, I've got page 4 up here for Lesson 4 in the corner of my paper so I can kind of keep them all organized. And a continuation of the British Constitution, that's question number 5. And so I made a note that the King and Parliament had a power struggle, lots of fights in the 1600s, and here's the key issue. Did the Crown have to accept the supremacy of laws made by Parliament? Well, I put a note over here for prior knowledge. It makes me think of political parties question that we went over. How much power should the federal government have? And there's a reason for that. Because it's always been in our mindset about limiting the power of government. So the result of this question was the Petition of Right signed in 1628. And so from your notes you should be able to identify that King Charles I needed money to fight Spain, so he needed the consent of Parliament in order to get the money. Parliament forced KC1, King Charles I, to sign the Petition of Right, saying that taxes could only be raised with Parliament's consent. And also there's no quartering of soldiers in citizens' homes, and habeas corpus. You have to have a legal reason to hold you in jail. You can't be held indefinitely or at the whim of a king. That really does limit the power of the king. I also made a note of this over here in terms of looking at the progression of history, where King Charles I was executed. Then there was a civil war that resulted in Oliver Cromwell taking over for just a little while. Then King Charles II, of course, is going to become the new king. Now, all of this is really more world history, more so than civics, but knowing this progression could help you to understand causation, cause and effect, of how you get the Petition of Right, and these three main things that we need to remember from the Petition of Right. That you can only be taxed with Parliament's consent, no quartering of soldiers in your homes, and habeas corpus. And I put a blue note right here, strengthen the power of Parliament and people over the king, that this limits the power of the king or government, that I'm making those connections in terms of looking at limiting the power of federal government in the United States and limiting the power of the English king and giving people more power than what the king had over them. So I made a point to make it really big in my notes. This is a big change where Parliament becomes powerful, even more than the king by the end of the 1600s. Because, yeah, that's really significant. And I've got embedded here, too, some vocabulary terms, as we see. And then also I've made note of the Glorious Revolution. So this is the page that actually is part of what we're talking about. And you may want to pause the screencast here to read through this section and listen to the video, as well as listening to this section and the video, or reading this section and listening to the video, to try to figure out if you were going to take notes, what notes would you pick out from these two particular pages? So again, this column and a little bit over here we've already taken notes on in terms of looking at habeas corpus, for example, and how the Parliament's power supersedes that of the king by the end of the 1600s. So with the Glorious Revolution, what we're looking at here is how monarchs were actually asked to come and to rule over the people with stipulations. And so I have that noted with the Glorious Revolution here at the bottom of my page, where Parliament's struggle with the king ends in a bloodless revolution, where William and Mary are asked by Parliament to rule with Parliament. That's your stipulation. They kind of had to follow the rule of law, and also be willing to rule and work with Parliament. This is going to lead to the English Bill of Rights. So again, that's cause and effect, causation, but also I have something that connects us to prior knowledge. It reminds me of the Revolution of 1800. There was this bloodless change of power. Yeah, that's pretty significant to make that connection of prior knowledge. Even though the Glorious Revolution came first, but this is a bloodless change of power where you've got this king and queen asked to rule as a monarch with Parliament. And nobody died over this one. That was a pretty big deal. It's a pretty big deal because that's going to lead us into eventually the English Bill of Rights, which are right here. And notice that these are 2 bullet points that your notes should mirror in terms of pulling out 2 important principles that influence constitutional development in America from the English Bill of Rights. And that's rule of law, which we've kind of talked about before, and representative government. So hopefully you've already taken a second to read through this page, and maybe even watch the video, in order to take note of this particular page with the English Bill of Rights, Rule of Law, and Representative Government. So on my last page of notes, page 5 from lesson 4, with continuing the British Constitution from question number 5, the English Bill of Rights limits the King's power to raise money and guarantees freedom of speech in Parliament. Those are significant, but notice that the book pulls out 2 important principles that influence American constitutionalism. And I've got them again pulled out and structured like the textbook does, Rule of Law and Representative Government. Connected that to the Magna Carta that we've taken a look at previously, and representative government. There's a representation of social classes, and I've tried to pull in some connection to prior knowledge here, where I put in pink. Representation of the monarch, which is ruled by one, which is a dictatorship. Aristocracy of the House of Lords, which is rule of a few, and I put down the word oligarchy, which is one of our terms or types of government from Unit 1. And the House of Government, which is the rule of many, which could be democracy. It could possibly also be a republic. And that's what I put here. It reminds me of a republic, and that pulls in that prior knowledge. But one thing that the U.S. did differently, and so things that are different, that are big changes or causation, all of those things should be made note of, in particular, in your notes. Those are your big picture items. The United States rejected that feudal idea of representation by social classes, which are here, monarch, aristocracy of the House of Lords and the House of Commons, and favored social equality, and again reminded me of Amendment 14, and yeah, you can say it out loud, equal protection under the law. So that brings in again prior knowledge. And so you can take a look again, of course, at the section exercises and reviewing and using the lesson in order to practice. But also there are some cartoons here with information bubbles that you could click on and use that to help you to review for the next couple of pages. You can click on those information bubble at the bottom, and one more here as well, so you can take a second to take a look at those. Otherwise, that's the end of these notes. But now we've taken detail for notes. Now we need to go back and review it. Reading it just one time for detail is oftentimes not enough to be successful, or as successful as you can be if you were to just go back and review your notes now for big picture statements. So again, I'm back on my first page of notes, and we're going to go through these again. And one of the things I would do is I would highlight and identify key terms or phrases and vocabulary words that are in your reading assignment. And notice I did that with like British origins of American constitutionalism. So I answered that question here, fall of Rome with William the Conqueror and Parliaments, House of Lords, House of Commons, and common law, and how that leads into the development of the rights of Englishmen, the Magna Carta limiting the power of the king, the Petition of Rights and English Bill of Rights here with the Parliament increasing or up arrow power, with the English Bill of Rights being a representative government and rule of law, and how the Magna Carta is rule of law, basic rights, and government by contract. So these things are really important to look at how America's Constitution is based on the British Constitution. So this should give you a big picture statement of what the American Constitution is going to look like. And when you go back through, that's why I have these highlights in here. I mean, this is the end result of my notes. But to go through and look at these big picture statements of cause and effect, like I highlighted the fall of Rome, William the Conqueror, and Parliament, and model Parliament that's split into the House of Lords and Commons, and how kings used the model Parliament and how citizens used the model Parliament. And again, I continue to do that on page 2, where I highlighted common law, precedent, and stare decisis, and that's your vocabulary terms, with the prior knowledge. Question number 4, I highlighted custom and tradition, personal rights, trial by jury, security, and limit on government's power to tax, because that brings us into the things that the United States has that links us to prior knowledge. And again, I also highlighted the Magna Carta, and obviously noted that Magna Carta is really, really important because it's mentioned so many times. And also, I've gotten to page 3 about how the Magna Carta is broken down into 3 principles. Now, if I was going to read this as a student, I probably would have done like those first couple of questions, maybe questions 1 and 2, maybe even 3, before I really got into this question here. And I looked at Magna Carta, how that was broken down into rule of law, basic rights, and government by agreement or contract. And I put those things in blue. That's pretty significant about allowing subjects to go to war with the king, how that's connected to the American Revolution. and how these things become the basis for U.S. government. As an example, no taxation without representation in the colonies, and I knew that. And then question number 5, I started out with an overview like the textbook had, but then I also went into more detail with the Petition of Right and the English Bill of Rights, because I've already gotten the Magna Carta, so I drew myself a little arrow back to the Magna Carta. So with my page 4, I made a note by highlighting how the Parliament and King had a power struggle with the key issue. Then here's the Petition of Rights, and those 3 things that the book called attention to, specifically with the Petition of Right about taxation, quartering troops, and habeas corpus. So you need to know what those things are. And then I have my little prior knowledge and other extra notes on the side. And how this big note is in the middle. It's starred kind of in the middle, and also I've highlighted that and noted it was a big change. Then I have the Glorious Revolution there and how that connects with prior knowledge. That leads us into page 5 about 2 of the important influences here from the English Bill of Rights with the rule of law and representative government. And then ended with this blue note about how the United States actually doesn't use this part for representative government, but is more representative based on social equality, which again reminds me of Amendment 14. So Amendment 14 obviously is pretty significant about equality and equal protection under the law. So this is the end of part 3 for the screencast and end of lesson 4. So, I mean, it's taken us about 45 minutes just to go through this as a screencast. And again, it should take you about an hour and a half to do that if you're just reading it specifically, taking notes, and then going back to review. But that's how you're going to get the most out of your reading assignment, because these are pretty significant and will lay the foundation of what we cover now, and also lays the foundation of what we're going to cover in the future about American constitutionalism. So even though I don't take up these notes, I would like for us to kind of show these to each other in class to make sure that we're held accountable for these. But you are going to have a quiz on lesson 4 in the future.